Every immortal was once someone who chose not to die. The cemetery breathed with November cold, and Mara had learned long ago that graves remember. She was 9 years old when she first placed the rose on the headstone, not because anyone had asked her to, but because the stone itself seemed to whisper. The flower was crimson, stolen from her mother's garden before the fever took her 3 months prior, before the world became a place where Mara spoke only to the dead. The gravestone read, Henrik Volkov, born 1847, gone 1889, no other words. Her fingers traced the dates. He had lived only 42 years. She wondered what kind of man died so young and left behind such a heavy silence. Every night after school, after her father returned drunk and asleep, Mara walked the winding paths between the stones. The roses became a ritual. One rose, placed gently against the weathered granite, always by dusk. The groundskeeper stopped asking why. Even he could feel it, the peculiar magnetism of that corner of the cemetery where the light seemed to linger differently, where the fog never quite settled. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell thick and merciless, and Mara still came, her small hands numb, her breath crystallizing in the air like prayers. She wore her mother's shawl, frayed at the edges, smelling still of lavender and mortality. The rose she carried that night was the last from her garden. She had saved it, pressed it between cloth, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment was now. "I don't know why you come," a voice said. Mara froze. Her hand hovered above the stone. The voice had emerged from somewhere beneath the earth itself, hollow and fractured, like wind through a crypt. She turned slowly, expecting to see the groundskeeper, or perhaps her own fear made manifest. Instead, she saw nothing but snow and shadow. "Who's there?" Her voice was smaller than she intended. "Someone who has been listening to the sound of your footsteps for 91 nights. The voice grew clearer now, layered with something that was not quite human, not quite alive. "Someone who remembers what it feels like to be forgotten. And you, small one, you are keeping me from forgetting." Mara's heart did not race. Instead, it stilled, as if her body already knew what her mind could not yet comprehend. She looked down at the grave, then back at the darkness. "Are you dead?" she asked. A sound emerged that might have been laughter, or sorrow, or both. "I have been dead for longer than you have been alive. But you—" And here the voice softened, became something tender and terrible. "You are keeping me alive." The snow fell between them, indifferent to mysteries. Mara knelt and placed the final rose against the stone. Her fingers trembled not from cold, but from the sudden weight of understanding. She had been talking to a grave. Now the grave was talking back. And somehow, impossibly, she was no longer afraid. "Will you come back?" the voice asked, and in it lived a hunger so old, so achingly human, that Mara knew she would return. Not because she was brave, but because, for the first time since her mother died, someone was asking her to stay. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. Chapter 2. The Language of Graves. The voice had no face, but Mara began to understand its geography. It lived in the soil beneath the headstone, in the roots that coiled around something or someone. Every night she returned, and every night the conversation deepened, moving from simple questions into confessions that neither should have spoken aloud. Henrik told her he had been a surgeon once, in Vienna, in a time when blood was a language he had learned to read like poetry. His hands had saved lives until they took a life instead, a woman's life. An affair that ended in violence, in a choice made in darkness, in the embrace of something older than God that offered him forever instead of the noose. "I chose this," Henrik whispered through the frozen earth. I chose death over execution. I chose darkness over daylight. And for 100 years, I have chosen silence instead of screaming. Mara listened while the snow collected on her shoulders. She was 9 and old simultaneously, the way children can be when they understand that the world contains both beauty and devastation without apology. Why are you telling me? She asked. Because you are the only one who has ever stayed long enough to hear, Henrik said. Because you left roses instead of forgetting. Because you are broken, small one. And I recognize the landscape of a shattered soul. He was right. Her father had become a stranger in their own home, speaking only in slurred words and accusations. He blamed her for her mother's death, as if a child could have bargained with the fever, could have offered herself instead. The school children called her the morning girl. Even her reflection had begun to feel like a stranger. I'm not broken, Mara said, but her voice cracked. No, Henrik agreed gently. You are becoming broken. There is a difference. Broken things can still choose how they fragment. Over the following weeks, Henrik taught her the history beneath the stone. He spoke of Vienna's chandeliers, of blood on surgical instruments, of the moment he understood that immortality was not a gift, but a sentence. He told her about the woman he had killed, not with malice, but with carelessness, with the cruelty of a man who thought himself untouchable. And he told her about the century of penance that followed, sleeping beneath the earth, unable to die, unable to truly live. Why didn't you just walk into the sunlight? Mara asked. Because, Henrik said, I am a coward. Even monsters cling to existence. Mara brought him books she stole from her father's library, medical texts, poetry, philosophy. She read passages aloud while sitting on the frozen grave, her voice the only warmth in that corner of the cemetery. Henrik listened with the hunger of someone starved for meaning, for connection, for proof that he had once been human, and perhaps, through her presence, could be again. One night, her father followed her. She didn't see him until it was too late. A shadow moving through the fog, reeking of alcohol and rage. He grabbed her arm, his fingers bruising the delicate bone beneath her coat. What are you doing here? He demanded. Talking to stones like a madwoman. Before Mara could answer, the ground itself seemed to convulse. The earth at the base of the grave split with a sound like breaking bone. Something rose from beneath, not fully, never fully, but enough. Enough for her father to see the shape of something that had no business existing in the world of the living. He ran. He did not stop running until he reached the city, and within a week, he had disappeared entirely, leaving Mara in the care of her elderly aunt. He's gone, Mara told Henrik the next night. Did you do that? I protected what was mine to protect, Henrik said quietly. You are the only thing I have had to protect in 100 years. I will not apologize for that. Mara understood then that love, even this strange, impossible, grave-bound love, was a force that rewrote the rules of the world. And she was not afraid. Chapter 3. The Rose Blooms at Midnight. 2 years passed. Mara grew taller, her childhood dissolving like morning frost, but her devotion to the grave remained unchanged. Every night, without fail, she placed a rose. Fresh ones she learned to cultivate in secret, growing them in boxes hidden on her aunt's roof, where no one thought to look. Henrik's voice had become familiar as her own heartbeat. They spoke of everything, mathematics and murder, mercy and madness, the weight of choices, and the price of immortality. He taught her the names of stars, visible only from the cemetery. She taught him that the world had changed, that there were motor cars now, and electricity, and people who flew through the sky. Tell me what you look like, Mara asked one winter night when she was 11. I cannot show you, Henrik said. The sun would take me to ash. Then describe yourself to me. There was a long silence. When he finally spoke, His voice was textured with old shame and older sorrow. I have the face of a man who died young, black hair, now tinted with the frost of centuries, eyes that were once blue, before the hunger changed them to something amber and terrible. I was handsome once, I think. Now I am beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, symmetrical, lethal, alone. Mara closed her eyes and saw him clearly, not his body, but his soul. She understood that beauty was only a hollow word until it was paired with suffering. Henrik was beautiful because he was tragic. I think you're beautiful, she whispered. Don't, Henrik said, and there was urgency in his voice now, a note of warning. Don't gift me with beauty, child. I am a monster wearing the face of what I used to be. You're not a monster to me, Mara said. You're the only person who has ever stayed. That night, something shifted. Henrik's voice changed, became lower, resonated with something almost physical. Mara felt it move through her like electricity through water. She was too young to name it as desire, but old enough to understand it as transformation. You must leave this place, Henrik said, before it's too late, before I ask you for something I cannot take back. Why would I leave? Mara asked. Because I am eternal hunger with a voice, and you are becoming the only thing I hunger for. But Mara didn't leave. She stayed night after night, and the roses began to bloom in patterns that defied seasons. Red roses in January, white roses in July, and always, always, the scent of them drifted over that corner of the cemetery like a prayer answered in reverse. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. Chapter 4. The Midnight Visitor. Mara was 16 when she finally understood what Henrik was asking of her. Not with words, but with the weight of silence between them, the kind of silence that contains entire universes. She had grown into her mother's beauty, with the same silver-blue eyes and dark hair that fell like rain. But where her mother had been gentle, Mara carried an edge that came from loving something impossible. Her aunt worried. The village priest warned her about the danger of isolation. The other young people at school found her strange, unchanging, devoted to a single stone in a forgotten cemetery. Come away with me, a boy named Thomas had asked at the autumn fair. He was handsome, alive, offered her a future measured in years instead of centuries. Mara had declined so gently that it took him weeks to understand she meant it. That night, she told Henrik about the boy. You should go with him, Henrik said, and she heard the pain threaded through his words like blood through water. You should have a life, a human life. I don't want a human life, Mara said. I want your life. You cannot have it, Henrik said, not in the way you think. I am not offering you love, Mara. I am offering you damnation. Then damn me, she whispered. The night of her 16th birthday, Henrik asked her to bring him something beyond roses. He asked for blood, not hers. Never hers, he insisted, not yet. But the blood of an animal, a deer, if she could manage it. Something with which to break his fast, to gather his strength, to prepare for what would come next. Mara understood then what he was preparing for. He was going to rise from that grave, and she was going to let him. For 3 weeks, she saved blood in glass bottles hidden in the cemetery's abandoned groundskeeper's cottage. When she had gathered enough, she poured it over the grave in patterns that Henrik guided her through, ancient symbols drawn in crimson on frozen earth. The night she finished the final symbol, the grave began to crack. The sound was not violent, but deliberate, the emergence of something that had been patient for 100 years. The earth opened like a mouth, and from beneath it came a figure that was both more and less than Mara had imagined. Henrik was pale as starlight, his eyes burning amber in the darkness. He wore clothes that had rotted to threads, and his skin had the translucency of old parchment. But when he moved, it was with the grace of something that had once been human and had transcended the limitations of flesh. "You should run," he said, his voice raw from a century of silence. Mara did not run. She stepped forward. "I'm not running," she said. "I'm finally arriving." Henrik reached for her face with hands that trembled. His fingers were ice and fever simultaneously, and when they touched her skin, she felt the transfer of everything he had endured: the guilt, the hunger, the endless nights beneath the earth, the slow forgetting and refusal to be forgotten. "I will take everything from you," Henrik warned. "Then take it," Mara said. "I have nothing left to lose." He kissed her, and the world rewrote itself. The cemetery vanished. The roses turned to ash. And Mara understood that she was crossing a threshold from which there was no return, not death, but something more terrifying: the choice to become eternal. Chapter 5. The Blood Teaches. The transformation took 3 nights. Henrik had rented a small house on the edge of the city, where the shadows were deep and the windows faced away from the dawn. He kept Mara in darkness, feeding her small amounts of his own blood, while her human body rebelled and reformed, cell by cell, into something other. She burned. She froze. She forgot what hunger felt like for food and remembered it only as a roaring thirst that demanded something living, something warm, something that screamed. "This is mercy," Henrik whispered to her in the darkness. "This agony. This is mercy because it means you're becoming strong enough to survive what comes next." On the 3rd night, as her eyes opened and saw in perfect clarity the geometry of shadows, Mara understood that she was no longer the girl who had left roses on a grave. That girl had died. And this new thing, this hunger with her face, was what remained. "Drink," Henrik commanded, and he drew a line across his own throat with a blade. His blood fell like rain, and Mara drank with a desperation that shamed her and thrilled her simultaneously. The taste was complex: ancient wine, iron, regret, love, the flavor of someone who had existed too long and was grateful, finally, to share that burden. When she had finished, Henrik held her while she wept. Not from pain, but from the understanding of what she had chosen: eternity, hunger, the slow erasure of the human world's meaning. "There will be a price," Henrik said. "There is always a price." Over the following weeks, he taught her the rules of their new existence: never hunt in the city where they lived, never leave witnesses, never fall in love with the living. It would only end in their destruction or their transformation. Never, under any circumstances, speak of Henrik to anyone, because there were older things than vampires, and some of them were still looking for him. "Why are they looking for you?" Mara asked. "Because I was supposed to die," Henrik said. "The one who made me expected me to end myself within a decade, as most of our kind do, but I chose to bury myself instead, to wait, to become a cautionary tale. I broke the compact. And I have broken it further," Mara said, understanding, "by pulling you out." "Yes," Henrik said, "and now they will be looking for us both." But Mara found she did not care. She had spent her entire human life waiting for her mother to recover, for her father to sober, for the world to make sense. Now transformed, she existed in a state of perfect vigilance. Every moment was sharp-edged and meaningful. Every night was a choice to be alive. She and Henrik became hunters, moving through the countryside like ghosts. They took only what they needed, only from those whose deaths would ripple outward in ways that no one would trace back to the 2 figures who appeared and disappeared like rumors. One night, 6 months into her new existence, Mara asked Henrik if he regretted making her. "Every moment," he said, "and never." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer that exists," Henrik replied. "Love and regret are the same thing, Mara. They are the 2 faces of eternity. We chose this knowing it would be beautiful and terrible and eternal. Mara understood then that Henrik had stopped trying to protect her from damnation and had instead accepted that they were damned together, and that made all the difference. Chapter 6. The Rose Returns. Years dissolved into decades. Mara and Henrik moved through the world like echoes of themselves, carrying only what could be held in their hands and what lived in their hearts. They went to Paris and watched the city transform. They went to America and saw cities rise from nothing. They existed in the margins, between centuries, never fully present but never entirely absent. And in every place they went, Mara brought roses, red ones, pressed between cloth, kept alive through impossible means. She placed them in windows, on doorsteps, in the hands of sleeping children. A calling card, a confession, a prayer. "Why do you still do that?" Henrik asked one night as she arranged a dozen roses in an abandoned chapel they had claimed as temporary refuge. "Because," Mara said, "someone left roses on a grave once, and it saved me. I'm returning the favor to the world." Henrik understood then that she was no longer the girl who had sought redemption through devotion. She had become something else, a creature that dispensed grace to the living while herself remaining damned. It was beautiful and tragic in equal measure. When the first hunter found them, Mara was ready. The creature that came was older than Henrik by several centuries, a thing of pure hunger that had been sent by the compact to correct Henrik's original transgression. They fought in an abandoned warehouse, and Mara discovered that the centuries of patience she had learned from Henrik had taught her something invaluable: how to survive through stillness rather than speed. She won not through strength, but through understanding her enemy's hunger. She starved him of targets, moved like water around his violence, and when the moment came, she offered him the same choice Henrik had been offered 100 years prior: death or damnation. He chose death, and as he crumbled to ash, Mara placed a rose on the spot where he had fallen. "That," Henrik said, watching from the shadows, "is mercy I did not know you possessed." "I learned from the best," Mara said, "but the victory came with a cost." The older vampires now knew Henrik lived. They knew he had a companion. The compact would send more hunters, and eventually someone would come that even Mara's hard-won wisdom could not defeat. That night, Henrik made a choice Mara had not anticipated. He walked into the dawn. She tried to stop him, but he was stronger, more resolute. He had lived for nearly 2 centuries as punishment and penance. He had been given mercy by a girl who left roses on a grave, and now, he decided, was the time for absolution. "I love you," Mara screamed as his skin began to burn. "Then live," Henrik said as he turned to ash. "Live for both of us, and keep leaving roses. Let the world know that even monsters can choose love over hunger. That is my final sermon." If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. Chapter 7. The Eternal Bloom, Rewritten. Alone for the first time in 100 years, Mara walked through the world like a ghost, haunting her own existence. She did not hunt as ferociously as before. She did not hide as carefully. There was a carelessness to her immortality now, a suggestion that she was waiting for something, or perhaps someone, to come and finally end it. The first decade after Henrik's death was the hardest. She moved through cities like a phantom, watching humanity age and evolve while she remained fixed in the amber of her transformation. Paris became unrecognizable. Vienna, where Henrik had once been a surgeon with steady hands and a human heart, had become a place of ghosts within ghosts. She could not return there without hearing his voice echoing through every street corner, every hospital, every shadowed alleyway where lovers once met in secret. Instead, she went to places he had never been. She went to the north, to the frozen lands of Russia and Scandinavia, where the darkness lasted for months, and the cold reminded her that she was still capable of feeling something other than hunger. She existed in libraries, reading everything that had been written in the decades since Henrik's transformation. She learned about the world's wars, its revolutions, its slow march toward a future neither of them had imagined. But the roses continued. She became legend in certain circles, the pale woman who appeared in hospitals and left flowers on the bedsides of the dying, the woman who could be seen in the poorest districts of cities, distributing blood that somehow healed instead of corrupted, the creature of mercy that appeared and disappeared, leaving only the scent of impossible gardens in her wake. It started without intention. In Budapest, in a poorhouse filled with cholera victims, a young nurse had collapsed from exhaustion. Mara found her on the stone floor, barely breathing, and before she could think about the consequences, she had cut her own wrist and fed the woman her blood. The nurse survived. More than survived. She recovered with an energy that suggested she had been touched by something divine rather than damned. Word spread in whispers, not among the living, they had no language for what had occurred, but among those like Mara. The older vampires began to notice. Hunters came, sent by the Compact to investigate this anomaly, this creature that was using the gift of immortality for healing rather than predation. The first hunter arrived in Vienna in 1923, nearly 30 years after Henrik's death. His name was Constantine, and he carried with him the weight of the old laws. He was ancient. Nearly 300 years of existence had carved him into something that was barely recognizable as having once been human. His skin was leather stretched over bone, his eyes burned with the cold fire of someone who had executed hundreds of his own kind in service to the Compact. "You have broken the accords," Constantine said, finding her in the greenhouse she had secretly constructed in the mountains. His voice was textured with the accent of old Europe, with the authority of centuries. "You feed the living our blood. You heal what should remain broken. You offer hope to a species that should know only despair." Mara stood among her roses, her hands stained with soil and the red of her own blood. She did not run. She did not beg. She simply met his gaze with the calm of someone who had already chosen their fate. "I offer what Henrik offered me," she said quietly. "The possibility of mercy." "Henrik was a fool," Constantine spat. "And you are his echo, his penance made flesh. The Compact demands your death, and I have been sent to deliver it." They fought in the greenhouse, among the impossible flowers. But Mara discovered something in that battle that she had not anticipated. The centuries of patience Henrik had taught her, the way she had learned to move through the world like water rather than stone. These things had made her something Constantine was not prepared for. He was faster, stronger, older. But she was precise in a way that came from love rather than hunger. She fought not to kill but to understand, to see the moments when his defenses fractured, when the ancient creature beneath the armor of law and duty showed itself as something almost human. In the end, it was not violence that stopped Constantine. It was a rose. Mara pressed a single bloom into his hand, not the regular roses, but one of the impossible ones, the flowers that had absorbed decades of her own blood and became something other than botanical. When Constantine's cold fingers touched the petals, something shifted. He felt it, the centuries of isolation, the weight of enforcing laws he no longer believed in, the slow accumulation of a life spent choosing damnation over mercy. He crumbled to ash, not from violence, but from the sudden unbearable weight of his own existence, and Mara placed a rose on the spot where he had fallen. A final prayer for a creature who had forgotten how to choose anything other than obedience, but his death did not go unnoticed. Word returned to the Compact, and they sent another hunter, then another. Decades became a series of battles fought in abandoned places, in hidden gardens, in the spaces between civilization where the rules of the human world did not apply. Mara defeated them all, not because she was the strongest, often she was not, but because she understood something fundamental about mercy that even the oldest vampires had forgotten. Mercy was not weakness. Mercy was a form of power that could reshape reality in ways that pure violence never could. And yet, with each victory, the weight increased. The roses in her garden began to wilt despite her constant care. The impossible blooms that had sustained her for so long started to fade, their petals turning translucent, their stems becoming brittle. She realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that she was running out of time. Not time in the mortal sense, but something deeper. The connection to Henrik, the source of her transformed blood, the fundamental energy that had made her something more than a simple vampire. It was dissolving. She was becoming human again, or something worse, a vampire stripped of the grace that had sustained her through the centuries. 40 years after Henrik's death, Mara prepared to end her own existence. She chose a night when the full moon hung low and blood red in the sky. She dressed in white, her mother's wedding dress, somehow preserved through the decades, miraculously untouched by time. She went to the grave where it had all begun, where a 9-year-old girl had placed a single rose on a headstone and changed the trajectory of eternity. The cemetery was overgrown now, forgotten by the city that had expanded around it. Henrik's grave was unmarked, the stone long since removed or weathered beyond recognition. But Mara knew exactly where it was. She always knew. Some places wrote themselves into the blood, into the very architecture of the soul. She knelt on the frozen earth and prepared to end it. She had a blade, the same one Henrik had used to feed her blood during her transformation. She would walk into the dawn as he had done. She would end the wait of centuries. She would finally, after so long, be allowed to stop. But as she raised the blade, she heard it, a voice calling from beneath the earth. Not Henrik. She knew the sound of Henrik's voice, the way she knew her own heartbeat. This was something else, something younger, rawer, filled with confusion and the particular terror of someone newly damned. "Help!" the voice cried out. "Please, someone. I don't understand what I am." Mara lowered the blade. And in that moment, the weight she had been carrying for decades suddenly shifted. This was not her ending. This was her continuation. This was the reason the roses had bloomed for so long, the reason the compact had sent hunters, and the reason mercy had kept her alive when justice demanded she die. She was not meant to end. She was meant to teach. The blade fell from her hands, and Mara began to dig. Chapter 8. The Rose Eternal, Rewritten. The girl's name was Eva, and she had been buried alive by someone who had not bothered to explain what immortality meant. She had woken in the earth, gasping for breath that would never come, clawing at soil and stone, convinced she was being punished for some sin she could not remember committing. Mara pulled her from the grave as the sun began to lighten the horizon. The girl was pale as death itself, which was fitting because she was dead, though no one had bothered to tell her that yet. Her hair was dark and matted with grave soil. Her eyes were still a human blue, not yet transformed to the amber of newborn vampires. "What is happening?" Eva gasped, her voice fractured with hysteria. "Where am I? Why can't I breathe?" "You're not meant to breathe anymore," Mara said gently, holding her while she convulsed with the last of her human reflexes dying. "You have been transformed. You are no longer alive in the way you were before, but you are not dead. You exist in a space between, and that space is where you will learn to survive." It took 3 days for Eva's transformation to complete. Mara kept her in the greenhouse, away from light, away from the temptation of hunting. She brought her stored blood, her own, mixed with the blood of animals, a transition diet for a palate that had not yet learned to crave only human prey. "My maker," Eva said on the second night, when her eyes had finally shifted to amber and her fingernails had begun to darken. "Who was my maker? Do you know him?" Mara studied the girl more carefully. There was something familiar about her features, something that resonated with a memory from another time, another life. It took her a moment to place it. The shape of her cheekbones, the particular angle of her jaw. She looked like Henrik. "What was your maker's name?" Mara asked carefully. "I don't know," Eva said desperately. "I was in Vienna. I was a student of music, studying violin at the conservatory. There was a man at a concert, old-fashioned in his dress with strange eyes. He seemed to see something in me that no one else could see. We spoke for hours. I told him my entire life story. He invited me to dinner in his apartment, and then—" Eva's voice broke. "And then I woke in the earth, and I have no idea what I am, or why I can hear people's heartbeats from rooms away, or why the smell of blood makes me want to scream." Mara's heart, which had not truly beaten in over a century, seemed to stutter. Henrik had created a child. Decades after his own death, somehow, impossibly, Henrik had found a way to ensure his legacy would continue. "Your maker," Mara said slowly, "was named Henrik Volkov. He was a surgeon once, a long time ago. He was kind when he could be, and cruel when he felt he had to be. He was my—" She paused, searching for a word that could contain what Henrik had been to her. Lover seemed too small. Creator seemed too clinical. Everything, perhaps, was the truest answer. He was everything to me. "Is he still alive?" Eva asked, hope and terror warring in her voice. "No," Mara said. "He chose to die. But if he created you, if he found you across the decades and marked you for transformation, then perhaps he left something behind. Perhaps he wanted to ensure that the knowledge of mercy he possessed would not die with him." Over the following weeks, Mara taught Eva everything Henrik had taught her. She showed her how to hunt without leaving traces. She taught her the songs that made the hunger bearable, old lullabies from her own childhood, mixed with the classical music that Henrik had loved. She showed her the garden, the impossible roses that bloomed in impossible colors, and explained that each petal represented a choice made in defiance of damnation. "Why are we doing this?" Eva asked one night as they tended the flowers together. "Why are we choosing mercy when the world teaches us that mercy is weakness?" "Because," Mara said, "I was once a girl who left roses on a grave. I was alone in the world, broken by loss, and someone, something, beneath the earth chose to speak to me instead of remaining silent. That act of reaching out, that choice to connect rather than to isolate, was the most powerful thing I have ever experienced. And when I was transformed, when I became what we are now, I understood that my entire existence was going to be devoted to returning that grace. But what if no one appreciates it?" Eva asked. "What if we spend eternity offering mercy, and the world remains unchanged?" Mara smiled, and in that smile was the weight of centuries, the knowledge of battles fought and hunters defeated, the understanding that comes from refusing to die even when death would be easier. "Then we will have offered it anyway," she said, "because mercy is not meant to be appreciated. It is meant to be given, and the giving of it transforms the giver as much as it transforms anyone who receives it." Years became decades, became centuries. Eva became a teacher herself, and other newly turned vampires began to find their way to Mara's greenhouse, some drawn by rumors, some by the roses that appeared in the windows of their makers' homes, all of them carrying the same confusion and hunger and desperate hope that Eva had carried on the night she was pulled from her grave. Hunters still came occasionally, but they came less frequently now. The Compact had realized that Mara represented something that could not be simply eliminated. She had become a living argument against everything the Compact believed about damnation. She was proof that immortality did not have to mean cruelty, that vampires could choose something other than the endless consumption of human life. Mara moved through the centuries like a priestess of grace, tending her garden, teaching the newly damned, leaving roses in the windows of hospitals and orphanages and poor houses. She became a legend, the pale woman who appeared in the darkest moments of human suffering and offered not salvation, but connection. The creature who proved that even monsters could choose love. Sometimes, when she was alone in the greenhouse and the moon was blood red, she would hear Henrik's voice in the spaces between her heartbeats, not haunting her, but accompanying her, a presence that said, "You understood. You took what I could not finish and transformed it into something eternal." And Mara would press one of the impossible roses to her chest, over where her heart had stopped beating a century ago but never stopped feeling, and she would whisper back, "I am not finished yet, and I will never let what you taught me be forgotten." The story does not end because eternity does not end. It only transforms, the way roses transform from bloom to ash to the seeds that will become new blooms. Mara is still there, in the margins of the world, in the shadows of cities, in the hospitals and shelters where the dying are gathered. She tends her impossible garden. She trains the newly damned in the art of choosing mercy over hunger. She leaves roses in the windows of the living, small prayers in a language only the lonely can read. And somewhere, in the depth of the earth, in the places where graves are forgotten and stones are worn smooth by time, there are children of Henrik still being born, not through his direct creation, but through the legacy of transformation that Mara has sustained. Each one carrying forward the knowledge that love can survive eternity, that mercy can exist in the darkest places, that even monsters buried beneath the earth have the power to change the trajectory of destiny. The girl who once left roses on a grave is now a woman, though woman is the wrong word entirely. She is something older, something that has learned to exist outside the categories of human and monster, damned and redeemed. She is the bridge between worlds, the creature that proves even in the deepest darkness, even buried beneath the earth, even when you've chosen not to die, grace is still possible. Somewhere tonight, Eva is placing a rose on a grave while another of their kind watches and learns. Somewhere else, another newly turned vampire is feeding the blood of the willing rather than the blood of the hunted. Somewhere in the margins of your own city, the pale woman with the impossible flowers is leaving traces of her passage, quiet reminders that monsters can choose mercy. And if you've learned anything from this story, if you've sat with Mara and Henrik through their impossible century, if you've felt the weight of a choice made in darkness, then perhaps you understand now what has always been true. Every immortal was once someone who chose not to die. Every damned creature carries the possibility of grace. Every rose that blooms at midnight is a confession. I was broken. I was transformed. I was loved into eternity. And I will not let that love be forgotten. The roses continue. The mercy continues. And eternity, in all its terrible beauty, continues to unfold. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned.